Good afternoon, buenos dias, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Florida International University's Cuban Research Institute, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual afternoon with Ted Henkin and Sara Garcia Santamaria to discuss Cuba's Digital Revolution, Citizen Innovation and State Policy, a fascinating new book that examines the impact of technology in authoritarian states and transitional democracies. To introduce today's guests more formally, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jorge Duane, Director of the Cuban Research Institute and Professor of Anthropology at Florida International University in Miami. He has published extensively on Caribbean migration, ethnicity, race, nationalism, and transnationalism. He is the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of 22 books, including Picturing Cuba, Art, Culture, and Identity on the Island and in the Diaspora, and Puerto Rico, What Everyone Needs to Know. Throughout this afternoon's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen. And you can order your copy of Cuba's Digital Revolution from Books and Books below by pressing the green button anytime throughout. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Duane to the stage. Hello.
Thank you, Cristina. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the virtual book presentation of Cuba's Digital Revolution, edited by Ted Henkin and Sara Garcia Santamaria. As usual, we're very happy to co-sponsor today's event with Books and Books, and we're proud to present the most recent work by leading scholars and writers on the Cuban and Cuban American experience. We hope that we can soon sponsor in-person public events at Books and Books in Coral Gables. Let me remind you again that you can submit your questions either through the presentations or after our speakers are done. And then at the end of their presentations, I'll compile the questions and post them to the authors afterwards so they can answer as many of them as possible. I'm now pleased to introduce our guest authors. First, we'll hear from Ted Henkin, who is an associate professor of sociology and Latin American studies at Baruch College in the City University of New York. He also holds a joint appointment in the Black and Latino Studies Department at Baruch, where he previously served as chairperson, and is also a past recipient of Baruch's Presidential Excellence Prize in Teaching. He frequently teaches courses specializing in contemporary Cuban culture and society. During the spring of 2018, he held the Alfonso Reyes Chair at the Institut des Hautes Études de l'Amérique latine at the Sorbonne University in Paris. He earned his PhD in Latin American Studies at Tulane University and also holds a BA in Sociology and English from the College of the Holy Cross. He has published extensively on self-employed workers, cuentapropistas, tourism, and the internet in contemporary Cuba. He's the author or co-editor of two previous books, Entrepreneurial Cuba, The Changing Policy Landscape, published in 2014, and recently translated as Cuba Empresarial, Emprendedores ante una cambiante política pública, published in 2020, and also Cuba, a Global Studies Handbook, published in 2008. He's the author of the annual Freedom House reports on the state of the internet and political rights and civil liberties in Cuba. He's published book chapters and articles in numerous professional journals in English and Spanish, including Cuban Studies, Latino Studies, Latin American Research Review, Social Research, Encuentro de la Cultura Cubana, and Nueva Sociedad. He was the first American, El Yuma, as he likes to call himself, and sociologist to preside over the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy. He's also served as an expert on Cuba for various media, such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, NPR, BBC, and Telemundo. Our second speaker will be Sara Garcia Santamaria. Sara is an associate professor of global communication at Universitat Ramon Llull in Barcelona, and she previously taught communication at the Universidad Internacional Valenciana and the Universitat Jaume I in Spain. I see that Ted is on the side of my screen, but I'm going to go ahead and complete my presentation of the co-editor. Sara holds a PhD and MA in Journalism Studies from the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom. Her doctoral dissertation focused on media discourses of unity in Cuba between 1990 and 2012, and she has returned to Cuba to conduct further research. She also earned a bachelor's degree in journalism study from the University of Valencia in Spain. She's a former research fellow at the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research interests include media in restrictive contexts such as Cuba, safety of journalism, media in Latin America, and populist political communication. She is the vice chair of the political communication section of the International Association for Media and Communication Research and part of the research groups on media flows and the Varieties of Democracy project. She recently co-edited the book Media and Governance in Latin America, Toward a Plurality of Voices in 2021. Her articles have appeared in professional journals such as the Journal of Latin American Communication Research, Persona y Sociedad, and Humanities and Social Science Communication. So without further ado, I give you my friend and colleague, Ted Henkin.
All right. Well, let me start with the long list of thank yous that I want to give because this is a collaborative effort. This book is the product of at least 3 years of work, in many cases a lot longer. But it all started in Barcelona, actually, with a panel that Sara and I put together in 2018, 3 years ago. And that was called Cuba 2.0, How the Digital Revolution is Remaking the Cuban Revolution. And that was our book title for a while. But we decided that 2.0 was actually antiquated, and we moved on to 3.0, 4.0, and now Cuba's Digital Revolution. We also wanted to focus on Cuba, obviously, but too many people, when they talk about Cuba, they do so as if it's one thing. And so our subtitle is Citizen Innovation and State Policy, to look at the many different things that citizens are doing from the ground up and kind of compare that to and see how that is in kind of a dynamic, sometimes very tense, even confrontational interaction with the state policy in Cuba. And then, of course, there's state policy outside of Cuba, from the United States, from China, from Russia. And so all of those things are dealt with in a series of case studies in the book. But I want to thank Books and Books. Christina Nosti has worked with me. This is the third time. The third time is the charm. The third time I present a book at Books and Books in Miami and Coral Gables, this time virtually. I hope for my next book to be there in carne y hueso. Let me thank Jorge and Amy at FIU. The Cuban Research Institute is really a pioneer and giving a platform to scholars who focus on Cuba. Obviously, I want to thank Sara and all of our authors. She's the co-editor of the book, and she helped me recruit a wonderful group of 16 different authors, all who are doing cutting-edge research, whether from a media perspective, sociology, anthropology, economics, culture, cultural studies. And so Sara Garcia Santamaria, also has been studying Cuba and its media landscape. And we kind of split the difference. I have a kind of a track record of looking at the unofficial Cuba media world, and she started her research looking kind of within the official media world. And we've kind of come together with this book to kind of cover both of those areas and the ways that they interact. I also want to thank a number of people who helped us with the actual production of the book so that it would look as beautiful as it does. I have, of course, a copy of the book here, and we are all very, very happy with just, it's handsome, right? We're responsible for what's inside, not so much with what's outside, but people like Stephanie Hunter, the acquisitions editor at University of Florida Press, helped us make it a beautiful final product. Also, Rolando Pulido, the late Rolando Pulido, who left us back in February, designed the cover originally many years ago and allowed us to reuse it as the cover of the book. Orlando Luis Pardo Lasso, Lázaro Saavedra, Omar Santana, Joanny Sanchez, and Camilo Condis also all allowed us to use graphics, images, video stills in the book to make it, more beautiful, and also to help us communicate some of the ideas through comics, art, and other means. And also, I want to thank the public. You guys showing up and buying the book, and reading the book and sharing the information about the book, debating it, disagreeing with it, arguing about it, all make us happy, right? So buy the book, and if you can, buy it now from Books and Books. They have arranged a special deal with the publishers so that the book will cost you a lot less if you buy it right now from Books and Books than if you wait a little while and try to buy it later from the publisher, or God forbid, from Amazon. So with that said, let me now talk a little bit about the contents of the book. And to do that, I'm going to take the privilege of just reading a passage or two from the book to start off right from the beginning. And then I'm going to talk about some of the things that kind of came together that make the book unique. What are the contents of the book? What you might discover or encounter when you read it. So the introduction, which I wrote, talks about, or asks the question, a very pregnant question right now, and especially in the 2.5 years since Cubans on the island gained access to 3G digital mobile access to internet content. Who will control Cuba's digital revolution? Quote, Fidel was the first to realize the value that the internet would have in truly democratizing communication. He said it seemed to have been created for revolutionaries, given its capacity of spreading messages at an insignificant cost with an infinite reach, unquote. President Miguel Díaz-Canel, February 8, 2019. Quote, the flash drive is much more than a technological device. This tiny object that fits in your pocket, that's freedom. For many Cubans, it's the difference between being informed and ignorant, between silence and the word, between censorship and journalism. Yoani Sanchez, April 16th, 2016. The third quote I'm going to read is actually my daughter or son downstairs crying or asking for something. So if you hear that, know that I have a full house of Henkin, some very recently added, that may want to make their own quotes while we present this book. So those two quotes, or those two epigraphs, we use to begin the book because they are both very definite in the power of the internet and digital technology in changing Cuba. But of course, President Díaz-Canel and Yoani Sanchez probably agree on very little else besides the fact that these things are powerful and they are changing power dynamics, communicational dynamics in Cuba. The state socialist model officially instituted in Cuba in 1961, 2 years after the revolutionary triumph of 1959, gave the Cuban Communist Party a monopoly over both party politics and the mass media. By the time the PCC was formally founded in 1965, all pre-existing media outlets had either been nationalized or shuttered. Subsequently, the Cuban government used its media hegemony to socialize citizens in its version of a revolutionary society. This effort transformed all channels of broadcast media into state propaganda, starting with Granma, Cuba's national daily newspaper, whose masthead proudly and unequivocally proclaims it the official organ of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. However, since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the subsequent global proliferation of new information and communication technologies in the subsequent 30 years, basically 1990 until today, the Cuban government's media hegemony has progressively eroded, and Cuban citizens working independently of, if not always in opposition to the government, have increasingly become active participants in the worldwide digital revolution, remaking the Cuban media landscape in the process. This second informational, communicational, and technological revolution, a phenomenon we label Cuba's digital revolution, has erupted within the Cuban Revolution, leading to a dynamic and unpredictable struggle over the meaning, impact, scope, and direction of both. And so the number of questions that we tried to answer, and let me just tell you from the beginning, when we asked the questions, who will control Cuba's digital revolution? The answer that we discovered is no one, or you could say everyone, meaning that it is a scramble and we don't predict or declare a victor. What we're more interested in chronicling in the book is the kind of disappearance of a monopoly and the erosion of a hegemony and the explosion of 1,001 different media communicational dynamics. So some of the questions: who will control Cuba's digital revolution? Who will benefit from it? To what ends will it be applied? Who will be left behind? Will digital technology remake or perhaps remix the Cuban Revolution, as the government aims to do with its computerization of society policy? Or are the many diverse digital developments currently unfolding in Cuba, which we chronicle here, contributing to something more akin to an unmaking or upending of the revolution? Thus, the volume seeks to answer these and other related questions by convening a diverse group of global scholars and highlighting their original cutting-edge scholarship that critically analyzes the many and sometimes contradictory ways Cubans are using new media technologies to transform Cuban society from the inside out. And we highlight that inside out because of the civil society, digital innovations, and the state policy dynamic. But we also highlight that because there's an assumption that this is something that is arriving to Cuba, which is partially true, but it's also something that is being innovated and originated within Cuba. The conversations among Cubans that digital technology enables are often more important than the information that might get to Cuba from outside to change it or alter it. The different voices from within breaking through the internal information blockade are as important as any other violations of the external embargo or Cuba being cut off. And so those dynamics are very rich. Cuba in conversation with itself, and Cuba in conversation with its diaspora. And so those are other things that we're looking at. While the book's authors approach this phenomenon from a rich variety of disciplinary perspectives and sometimes inter or multidisciplinary perspectives, our main common contention is that technology is radically reconfiguring the evolution of the cultural, economic, and political project that is the Cuban Revolution in myriad unprecedented ways. And so that is our kind of like shot across the bow to highlight the many different things that are happening and the many different things that we're doing in the book. So now what I'd like to do is highlight a couple of those things, talk a little bit about the content of the book, and then pass word over to my colleague and partner in crime here, Sara, so she can share some of her own insights and reflections on the process of producing the book and on the contents of it, and perhaps even her chapter and her research. So, for me, the origin of this book began with my interest in the Cuban blogosphere, going back to 2007, 2008. I remember traveling to Cuba in 2008. Phil Peters at that time gave me a telephone number of a woman who was just becoming internationally known and eventually world famous, named Joanny Sanchez. I called up that number when I got to Havana. Ronaldo Escobar, her partner in crime, answered the phone, invited me over for lunch, and the rest is history. I interviewed them and have written for the next 12 or 15 years about the blogosphere as it then morphed into something different. And so what I wanted to do, and at least in my part of the book, is go beyond the blogosphere, because the blogosphere is old news in Cuba, right? It was very important, but it was a transitional stage that led us to this digital revolution that includes a whole cornucopia of diverse fascinating independent digital media startups, including El Estornudo, Periodismo de Barrio, 14 y medio, Tremenda Nota, and many others. And we have chapters in the volume by various scholars who deal directly with the dynamics of that transformation. So the idea of going beyond the blog, and that includes looking at independent media, but also looking at the phenomenon. Almost every chapter talks about el paquete, YouTubers and influencers, which are big in Havana, but even bigger, you guys in Miami know, in Miami, right? There's a whole group of Cubans who recently arrived, maybe in the last 5 or 10 years from Cuba, who are now, in this kind of battle of YouTuber influencers. And it's often interesting, entertaining, and enlightening sometimes to watch them go at it in their direct shows. Even more interesting maybe than watching the nightly news. There's SNET, a gaming community that has had a storied existence up until about a year and a half, 2 years ago, when it was kind of taken over or closed down by the government. There's the whole issue of the United States policy, the embargo, engagement under Obama, re-embargo under Trump, and how that plays out. We have a chapter written by Olga Krustaleva on that. There's business, there's self-employment, how self-employment, business, economics, how people in Cuba are taking advantage of digital technology to try to set up shop, make money, make a living. There's literature. There's a whole history of electronic magazines that were launched in the very early part of the 21st century. And we have a chapter by Walfrido Dorta on that. And then finally, there's culture, music, and fashion. And the woman or women of fashion, and Paloma Duong, who was going to join us today, but is suffering from a sudden migraine headache. She has an excellent final chapter that looks into those cultural media, music, and fashion dynamics as they develop both in Cuba, but also in interaction with the Cuban diaspora in Miami and elsewhere. Our book includes 14 chapters, 16 contributors. There are 6 Cubans or Cuban Americans, and I say in the introduction that they live in Cuba, Brazil, Mexico, US, and often live life on the hyphen between the Cuban and the diaspora parts of their existence. A number are graduate students in either Brazil or Mexico working on their doctorate, but they're all of Cuban heritage or ancestry. So about half of our people involved have that kind of origin. There are 2 Yumas, myself and Larry Press, 2 gringos, Americans, right? 2 British writers, both of whom are women who have done anthropological research, 1 Spaniard, 1 Norwegian, 1 Russian, 2 Mexicans, and 1 woman from France. So we have quite a global group of scholars, and it was quite an undertaking, an odyssey, working with them over 3 years, from an initial proposal to a first draft, in some cases to a translation of that draft. And Sara and I, got some gray hairs trying to make that all come out right. And we're very pleased, and we think that it did, certainly. And so what I'll do now is I will pause after giving you that kind of taste of who wrote the book, who is involved, what it touches on, and who we're grateful to. And I'll pass the word over to Sara so she can share her perspective and ideas with you.
Thanks a lot, Ted. First of all, I'm very glad to be here with you, and I would like to thank you all for joining us in this conversation. Of course, I would like to thank Ted. As you know, he's been a reference for everyone who started being interested in the Cuban media sphere, in the blogosphere, in digital technologies in Cuba. And I have to say, he's one of the first people who started studying Cuba in depth and conducting ethnographic work there before Cuba was famous, so before 2014. So it's been a pleasure to work with him. As he said, we came from different angles. He started looking at alternative voices, independent voices from the state, while at the beginning I was very interested in the state media, in journalists who work for the state and who could perform kind of a change from within the system. So we managed to meet each other and to find many interests that we had in common that have led to this project. So Ted has already, thank you all, and he has already introduced the book. So what I would like to do in this part of the presentation is to give you some insights of the debates that Ted and I had for a long time, the emails, the phone calls that went up and down, all these things we took into consideration for editing the book and cannot be really seen there, but we hope that their presence can be sensed throughout the chapters. So the first thing we knew when we started talking about the book is that we wanted to include the Cuban voice. We're not Cuban. We've been there, we know it pretty well, but we're not Cuban. So we started a real process of reading Cuban authors, like kind of reaching out to them, going to congresses and identifying who was really conducting good quality work on the Cuban digital sphere. So we realized very soon, of course, that there is not a Cuban voice. There's not such thing as the Cuban voice. There are many voices and many perspectives. So what we decided was to include as many points of view as possible. And I have to say that we managed to include the voice of Cubans and Cubans in the diaspora, which we're very proud of. We also have to acknowledge that not all voices are there. There were very long conversations with Cuban scholars who work in Cuba and who were very interested in the project, but they sensed that working with us could somehow damage their career back home. And this was, very sad. We did really want to include their voice, but we understood and we had to accept their decisions anyway. So as you know, Cuba is a very polarized context. And another question that was very interesting to us was how to avoid this polarization. We did not want to contribute to polarizing or to further polarizing debates with our book. As I said, we wanted to give a broad range of points of view, and well, how do you do that, right? How do you write about a very polarized context without or trying to avoid contributing to it? So, well, what we did was to expect that all voices were professional, that all works were academically sound and well researched, and it was not just a matter of opinion, that there were well-researched pieces of work, properly contextualized. Another thing we encouraged was all authors to write about their positionality. We all have a position, we all have a background, and we encourage them to be transparent about it and to write about it in their chapters. And finally, we try to encourage all writers to open up a debate, not to close the debate, but to foster debate and to open up questions that are relevant to all of us. So as I was saying, Ted and I are not Cuban, and there are a few other authors who are from the Americas or from Europe, and this could be problematic for some reasons, but we also saw it as an advantage. We didn't want to see another book that just gave a foreign vision of Cuba. We didn't want to be that. But we realized that Americans were talking to Americans, Cubans to Cubans, and Europeans were on the other side of the world, and there was no real space for debate. So what we tried to do starting in Barcelona in 2008 and 18, as Ted said, was to see the book as a space of encounter in which scholars from different places of the world could join together and engage in a conversation about digital Cuba. So finally, as I said, it can be problematic when privileged Western scholars write about foreign countries, and especially if they're in the global South. You can have this kind of academic extractivism of it, or if you want, parachute academia, as in parachute journalism, by which a foreign scholar just flies to Cuba, uses their super technological means to gather information in a record time, and then flees the country and never goes back again and leaves no trace. So when we thought about this, okay, there's going to be Cuban and non-Cuban authors, how do we do this? We wanted to make sure that all non-Cuban scholars, they had a set record of conducting extensive ethnographic work in Cuba, that they had been there, they had lived there, and they had a network of collaborations that were long-lasting, and we're not just going there, to realize that the project and leave afterwards, as I said, leaving no trace. So that gave us a small surprise that I think we're both proud of, and it's that a lot of the people who are conducting ethnographic work are in the early stages of their careers. And I think something that is very interesting about the book is that you have essential authors such as Ted, such as Paloma, but you also have a lot of young scholars, and a lot of young scholars who actually are from Cuba and know it very well and are very aware of the latest debates. And I think this is another advantage of the book, this capacity of bringing together people who have a voice, who are well respected in the field, and people who bring in new ideas. So those were the reflections that I wanted to share with you, and I hope they can also foster some debate. Thanks a lot.
All right. Let's see if I'm back on. Okay, good. What I'd like to do is deepen the conversation now a little bit before we get to to fielding questions from the public. And to do that, I think I will focus on December 2018. Our book started really in like May of 2018, but we worked on it over that next 3 years, and put together drafts between those 3 years. And interestingly, we didn't get the memo that the Cuban government was deciding to radically or significantly change its access policy, but after years of demands of greater internet access and continuing demands of lowering internet prices, or that the prices be lowered, in December of 2018, Cubans, woke up in early December morning and discovered that there was now the ability to contract and pay for 3G mobile internet on your telephone, on your cell phone. Now, being able to afford a cell phone, being able to afford paying for that connection are huge challenges for Cubans. And so even though it's a huge step forward in expanding access, it's still a lot of obstacles to that access, right? However, you can really think about that day as a before and an after in terms of the ways that Cubans interact with digital technology and access to, and use the internet. And so we have, as we were finishing the book, we kind of watched in real time a nonstop parade every month or two from Cuba of Cubans using these digital technologies in new and innovative ways, debates, arguments, ideas that had largely been trapped in cyberspace among a digitally literate elite, increasingly spilled out onto the streets of Cuba, the plazas of Cuba, in front of various ministries of Cuba. And so some of those included digitally enabled humanitarian relief for a tornado that hit Havana in January of 2019. There was protest by animalistas, animal rights advocates. There was an effort for people to advocate for abstention or voting no in the Constitution using the internet. Twitter became something used not only by, let's say digital mavens, independent citizen journalists, but by Cuban statespeople, ministers, the president himself, right? Actually, the quote that I began the book with and began today with is a quote that was tweeted out by the presidency of Cuba. quoting the president of Cuba, but the presidency of Cuba Twitter handle actually tweeted that. And I will just quickly now, since I can officially do it, I think I will try to share my screen here and show you that quote as it originally appeared. Fue Fidel, o Fidel fue el primero en percatarse del valor que tendría Internet para democratizar realmente la comunicación. Él decía que parecía creada para los revolucionarios por la capacidad de difundir mensajes a un costo insignificante con alcance infinito, right? And so that is a graphic of the quote that you guys can see me now and hear me. I hope that worked. We were testing it beforehand. But you see that Fidel is there bravely defying the world and using language that you might think was written in Silicon Valley or even by Giovanni Sanchez. And so we have, of course, don't accept that quote or any quote at face value, but the fact that the government itself is trumpeting technologies that it had at various points, demonized was extremely interesting to watch as we worked on this book. Of course, there was an independent LGBT pride march that took place. There's been various online protests about lowering internet prices, defending the takeover of the SNET community. And one of the quotes that we have in the introduction is actually from an old friend of mine who co-founded Yucabyte, which is an independent digital media startup focusing on digital technology. And he was quoted in the Washington Post. This guy's name is Norges Rodriguez, and Norges says that when the Washington Post asked him about the LGBT march, he said, when government authorities started detaining people during the unauthorized May LGBT march, they were looking for a leader, but since it was organized through social media, there was no specific leader. And that ability to convene publics, bring them together in public, take them out of the digital world, or at least jump over use digital technology to have convene something independently, a leaderless grouping to take physical space, often defined in Cuba as revolutionary space controlled by revolucionarios for them and for the government, right, is constantly being challenged. Of course, all of this culminated in a massive protest that was a reaction to a raid on November 26th. And so on November 27th of last year, 2020, you had upwards of 300 to 500 young people, artists, many mainstream artists, together with marginalized artists, protest in front of the Ministry of Culture. This also was something that was spread virally through use of the internet. The government responded to this, and then another series of convened protests by shutting off and on, limiting access, slowing down the internet. Another independent digital startup called Inventario has a number of really interesting articles that track the ways that state policy interacts with this citizen innovation in terms of these protests. All of this is related to some concepts that we try to follow in the book. And I'll end this section of what I'm saying by highlighting some of these concepts. The first is that information control in any society, authoritarian or not, but especially authoritarian societies, are built upon the fear of speaking out of turn, the consequences of speaking up. Also, that is combined with the second pillar of control, which is isolation of people who have ideas from other people who may share those ideas, but they may be ignorant about other people having those same complaints. And the ability for people in Cuba horizontally to share information, ideas, criticisms is really an unprecedented phenomenon that had happened, for a long time, as far back as 2007 with the email war, but that was restricted to email, right? a non interactive format, or a very difficult interactive format, and that took place basically among a cultural elite. These kind of things now are happening much more in real time among a broader swath of the Cuban population. At the same time, governments across the world and in Cuba have engaged in what has been termed networked authoritarianism, often muddying the waters. I mean, governments have two real main abilities in this type of control. One is simply a master switch to shut off access to the internet or parts of the internet, especially in a place like Cuba where there's a monopoly over servers and access, or a relative monopoly. But then, even though when you have access, there's a second series of strategies that attempt to muddy the waters of information sharing and debate by sowing distrust, spreading defamation, and taking available information that exists and making it unusable by creating this sense that any news is fake news, right? And of course, we in the United States are very well aware of this, given our recent political history that we're still kind of dealing with. Who do you believe? The rise of the internet has been democratizing, but it's also given rise to what some people call the kind of craze of the amateur, right? The amateur, giving access to the amateur can be democratizing, but it also can then sow distrust. And of course, the recent controversies with information posted on Facebook, Facebook's responsibility, Google's power over this. There's a really fascinating chapter in our book that kind of looks at Cuba. It's by Marie-Laure Geoffrey, a French scholar, who looks at Cuba at kind of necessarily coming to this debate late, because for a long time, because very little access was had to digital technology, it was seen as kind of a messiah or a savior, or at least an antidote to government control. But are you going to just exchange government control for corporate control, or who holds these international companies, Google, Facebook, Apple, etc., accountable? They're not democracies, and so that is an issue that she is kind of like, who is also critiquing the digital technology at the same time as they're using technology to critique the government. So that dynamic is analyzed in the book as well. Finally, there are 5 debates that we try to look at in different ways and different fashions in the book. There's this belief in liberation technology, but there's also this fear that access to the internet can promote a form of activism for the lazy called slacktivism, right? What's happening in Cuba? Remember that all the technologies, the second one is all the technologies that are available to amateurs or to independent autonomous groups are also available to the government. So networked authoritarianism is the warning that, hey, don't think that the access to the internet solves the problem of information control. It makes it much more complicated and dynamic, but it doesn't declare a winner, but it changes the game, right? Finally, additionally, there's the whole idea that these internet access technologies, we think of them as free. We call it Web 2.0, social media. But remember, they are owned by someone, and they're free because often our data, our information is used for those companies to make money. And that kind of a warning is, I think, important to remember when these are celebrated as necessarily or automatically democratizing forces in any society. It's also important to remember that the U.S. embargo has stipulations that make access to some of these technologies limited or off limits, depending on what law is applied by which administration over time. But just because they exist doesn't mean that Cubans can exist them, and it's not always the Cuban government the one who's restricting access to these technologies. A related issue has to do with Cuba's do-it-yourself culture, a way that Cubans have made The classic example, of course, are old American cars run for 60 years without American technology. But anyone who knows Cuba, and especially if you're Cuban, you know the endless inventive inventos that Cubans come up with to make things work. This also applies to the internet. And so one might expect, given the socialist, let's say, at least philosophy or system, that the whole idea of open source technology and open source networking could have been a major alternative that Cuba could have developed to these dominant players in the media landscape. However, in practice, autonomy and independent community organized groups that promote this kind of free software and open source software has been severely limited and constrained in Cuba by a traditional fear of autonomous independent activity. Armando Chaguacera calls this, with a fabulous term, autonomophobia, right? The fear of autonomous action, and that includes autonomous action, whether you're a coder, a programmer, or a journalist. So I'll kick it back over to Sara for some additional comments, and then maybe we can hear from the public.
Thanks, Ted. No, I was thinking as you were talking that what's been very interesting to me, at least in the media and journalism field, is to see that a few years ago, there was kind of this division between independent journalists who just saw themselves as not willing, they were not really willing to position themselves politically. They were just defining themselves, you know, I'm a professional journalist, and as such, I have to be as objective as possible or as unbiased as possible, and that's it. And also those who were called, you know, journalists, activists, and who did have a clear political position. So there was kind of this frontier between those who did activism and those who did professional journalism. And that was my perception for quite a long period of time. But recently, something interesting has happened. It might be thanks to the digital revolution and internet access. It might be just a consequence of shared repression, shared experiences of repression. But I can see that this frontier is disseminating. It's not as clear as it was. And I've seen a lot of these people coming together, protesting, as you said, but also joining shared declarations, shared petitions, asking the government for the same rights. And I think this is a recent change that has marked a big difference. And it's, independent people coming together, those who see themselves as independent from the state, also accepting that they share common goals and common strategies for achieving them. So I just wanted to point out that.
Yes, I've had exactly the same observation since I studied the blogosphere starting back in 2008. It's fascinating to see. And I think my own interpretation is that it is people who tried to position themselves in a kind of independent but not oppositional space in the media, within the blogosphere, learned slowly or quickly that was tolerable to the government. Those people who were trying to moderate, I think of people and organizations like Cuba Posible, Elaine Diaz, El Toque. They continue doing great work, but the space that had existed in part because of the engagement between the U.S. and Cuba on the governmental level has evaporated. They continue doing great work, but they are often labeled with just as denunciatory or defamatory language, and face real repression. The same as people who are declared dissidents who call for a change of regime. So that dynamic is fascinating. I don't know if Jorge, you wanted to bring up the questions now.
Yes. Thank you, Ted, and thank you, Sara, for your wonderful presentation. And also, I want to congratulate you on the book. I've read most of it, and I think it's a very original, very timely, well-written, and very informative discussion. So we do have a few questions up here in the screen, and I hope that more people will submit their questions as well. But just to begin, let me ask you a couple of questions to each one of you so that we can start the conversation. And Ted, I read your chapter on the transition of Joanny Sanchez from a bloguera to a professional journalist and director of 14 Medio. And I know you followed her career very closely. So I'd like you to comment on that process and the role of Joanny in this so-called digital revolution. And then for Sara, one of the things that you mentioned were the differences between U.S., Cuban, and European approaches. I think I know a little bit about the Cuban perspective, but I'm not so familiar with the European perspective. So if you can just say something about that question. Is it, for instance, you mentioned that a lot of European researchers have been able to do field work in Cuba, including yourself. Is that the main difference between a U.S. centered perspective? Is it theoretical? Is it political? So those are two sort of startups to begin the conversation. Ted?
Okay, so as I said before, one of the things that I wanted to do in the book project in general was to go beyond the blog and to essentially talk about someone other than Joanny Sanchez. However, I'm more guilty than anyone because my chapter is about Joanny and her arc, her career arc, you could say, as a communicator, as a very dynamic, effective communicator, as a blogger, then as an independent journalist, and then as a director of an independent media startup from Generation Y to 14 Medio. And so in many ways, I look at that transition beyond the blog. And what I kind of chart is a fascinating thing that in some ways is a springboard for the other chapters in the book, which is this. Joanny and her husband, Reynaldo, and their group that kind of worked together with them in various blogs and formats for years between about 2004 and 2014, over that 10-year period, they were all people who positioned themselves outside of the system. A handful of them may have had some media training or even worked in the media, but most of them were clearly positioned outside and critics of the system and kind of erupting with an alternative to the system, right? And Joanny argued in many ways that that was the experience of her generation. But of course, there are people who grew up within the system who believed in aspects of the system, who thought that the system was salvageable or reformable. And so what I track in that chapter is, let's say, Joanny and her project, its move from being decidedly outside and decidedly independent toward an effort to establish something more akin to a professional media enterprise that, if not objective, was trying to report the news and provide Cubans with information. Cubans have no lack of information. The problem is everyone's shouting at once. And so one of the things that they're trying to do is, in a systematic, professional way, do that. And so to me, that's a fascinating arc, because a blogger who has very incisive, let's say, opinions and can express them well is very different from running a media enterprise that has to pay the bills, pay reporters, and report the news, right? And that arc was fascinating. But at the same time, and this is kind of the project that I'm doing now, this new project, but it's also something that is done by some of the other authors in this book, which is to look at professionally trained journalists who had worked as journalists and how they have the professional aspect, at least a degree or the training or the experience, but they don't have the independence. And so their arc is the opposite direction. It's from an institutional, professional, titulado realm into a realm of always claiming or trying to become more and more independent that gave birth to this independent media sphere. So that to me is a fascinating, it's a convergence that wasn't really planned as one. As Sara and I were saying before, it's fascinating because those worlds that often try to distinguish themselves from one another have converged partly in response to government repression, but also partly in response to their own professional goals and paths as they have emerged. I mean, they don't always agree, but they agree on the necessary principle of media independence for it to have credibility.
Sara?
Well, I will not speak for American researchers, but I will speak for European ones. For obvious geographical and historical reasons, it's not very common to study Cuba from Europe. There's not that many people conducting research, and even less in our field. So I did my research in the UK, and I can say I know every single person who was doing research on Cuba. We had a gathering point, and that was the Cuban Research Forum at Nottingham University, led by Tony Capsia. And there was a meeting point, and also that's a place where we learned how to speak about Cuba, how to go there, and what kind of questions to ask, and from which spirit, right? And I have to say that in this center, the leading researchers, there were people who had like this very deep respect for the Cuban Revolution, and an admiration for all the good things, that Cuba has been, achieving over these years in terms of health, education. And there was this underlying idea that you were not going to Cuba to criticize Cubans, right? And that was very surprising to me at the beginning. And I don't think anyone took it as a censorship, but I think everyone took it as a realization that as a foreigner, you need to work with respect. And you have to try to understand and to get the Cuban point, which is why we tend to do ethnographic work and we commit ourselves to doing long stays there. I would also like to highlight that maybe in the traditional European left, in the progressive left, there is this romanticization of the Cuban Revolution. And still a lot of people see Cuba as this communist paradise, and they are interested in Cuba because of this. And they dream of traveling there one day and finding that this is possible. And I think this is also something that inspires a lot of researchers. And maybe it's not that obvious in the US, which is much closer and has a more patent conflict with the country.
Thank you both. Now let's take a few of the questions that we have on the screen. Gene Rosenberg, who always asks pointed questions from FIU, wants to know, how does the public internet in Cuba compare with the Great Firewall in China?
I'll give my 2 cents. The Cuban and the Chinese internet reality are vastly different. I don't know, I'm not a China expert, but what I do know is that China, as we all know to some degree or another, is an economic powerhouse, and Cuba is an economic basket case. And the distinction then is that in China, the government operates 2 forms of censorship. One is this Great Firewall, but we put too much emphasis on that. What the real thing that happens in China is that there's a huge, dynamic, very, very lucrative and active telecom industry in China, competition and different groups and access, but they all have to sign a pledge and then fulfill that pledge every year. And there's awards given out by the government to censor their own users. So there's private companies and there's widely accessible internet in China and use and innovation, but there is massive censorship from the private sector because the government requires it, right? In Cuba, you have a very, very different dynamic and changing, but different reality. Essentially, Cuba had no internet up until about 2008. And then as it had grown since then, it's very slowly, access has been growing, but there's no private sector internet telecom provider. There's a monopoly state provider. In terms of then access, I would say that probably China is much better at censorship, even though in China there's much more ability to use and access the internet, whereas Cuba is probably a lot worse at censorship, but there's a lot less to censor because less people are online, less percentage of the population. I don't know if Sara has a different or a smarter answer than I.
No, I agree with Ted. I'm not an expert on China either, but I remember talking to journalists who work for the state-run media, and they acknowledged that the state was sending journalists to China and to Vietnam to learn from them, to learn, about their strategies. And so there's definitely an influence and their reference for the Cuban government. But as Ted said, I don't think a few years ago when anyone had a VPN in Cuba or needed one, and a lot of these then circulated offline. So it was, not even necessary to exercise open censorship or to block websites till quite recently.
Thank you both. And now we have a question from our colleague, Josiana Arroyo, who wants to know how independent journalism has changed the ways news as well as local issues and citizen response happen on the ground.
All right, well, yeah, I mean, both the paquete, but even more so the access to 3G 2.5 years ago has radically changed the media environment and in at least two ways. The first way is that the state media, even though it's still basically state propaganda, party propaganda, has been forced a number of times, 12, 15, 20 times you can count. And actually, Jose Raul Gallego, a colleague and a Cuban colleague who's in Mexico, who was a professor of journalism in Cuba before he had to leave quickly from Cuba. He has done research that looks at how state media has changed its agenda and has been forced to address topics that it had systematically ignored and silenced in the past, because everybody on the street is already aware, first through some access to the internet, and then through what the Cubans call Radio Bemba, right? It comes out, maybe a fifth or 10% of the population get access to this independently reported news about something. It could be a femicide. It could be, someone dying under suspicious circumstances in police custody. It could be, this thing that we saw on November 27th, right? A protest. People are already learning about it, and they're learning about it from independent media. So the state is forced to give its version of events and compete against the independent media. Over the last 3 or 4 months, Cuba has systematically engaged on nightly national television and defamation campaign against independent media startups and journalists. And they're doing that because these people were being effective and successful and changing the informational dynamic in Cuba. And so now, instead of ignoring them, they're trying to defame them, and that's been forced upon them. I think that, to me, is the main dynamic change. The other thing is just the quality, diversity of the reporting is really expanded at the same time as the repression has increased, and increasing numbers of the reporters who work for these independent startups are being forced into exile. Once again, this has happened for 60 years, and this is a very fascinating thing, because now these independent startups are finding it necessary and maybe even advantageous to function with 1 foot in Cuba and 1 foot in Madrid, or 1 foot in Miami, or 1 foot in Mexico, or all 3 or 4 places, because they need to have reporters on the ground in Cuba, but they also have to have financial, logistical, technological foot and establishment in another country where they can function more freely.
Sara, do you want to say something?
Yes, I would like to add that there's a very important element, which is access to news sources. The state-run media, they have access to official sources, and most of the news stories, they're based on these opinions, what officials say or what government representatives say. While independent media outlets, right now, they really don't have access to official sources. And so what do? What kind of sources can they access? Citizen sources. All they can do is actually go on the street and ask citizens, and this has produced a very important change, and it's that people now are speaking and they see their voices disseminated, and they hear a variety of opinions that you cannot find in the state-run media, but just because of sources, something as simple as that.
Okay, moving on to another question. Rene Costales asks, have you observed any type of corporate social responsibility being offered by the monopolistic internet service provider in Cuba?
Sara, would you like to go first on this one?
I'm not sure I understood the question. Sorry for that.
Okay, I'll say it again.
I'm not sure I understood the question.
Yes, I'll repeat it. Have you observed any type of corporate social responsibility being offered by the monopolistic internet service provider in Cuba? I guess he's referring to Atexa.
Yeah, Deb, I don't know if I understand the question. Do you want to go first? Sorry.
I'll answer my version of it. First of all, let me thank Rene Costales, an old friend from ASCII, for attending and asking a question. I would say no. My experience with the citizen feedback about Atexa is almost all of it is bad, negative, critical, both in terms of the prices, in terms of the service, in terms of its responsiveness, even though you can clearly see a drop gradually over the last 5 to 7 years in prices. Cubans are still complaining about them for just reasons, because they don't square with Cuban salaries, right? In terms of, and I think it bears repeating. And again, I know Rene from ASCII, right? A group of mostly economists, and they would appreciate the problem with monopolies, right? Is they have no incentive to offer better service because they're the only game in town. I mean, right now, Joe Biden is about to announce something in the U.S. to increase competition in the United States because many industries have become monopolized by unresponsive, hegemons. In Cuba, that's old news because of the monopoly from Atexa running the telecom system. And if anything would make service better, responsibility more, more real, and prices lower, would be introducing competition and a market system. At least that's my analysis and opinion, maybe, about it. But yeah, there is a corporate social responsibility movement or idea in Cuba, but it is not really, at least in my knowledge, not really connected to the official government service provider or anything like that. It has to do more with some people who are self-employed and involved in community organizing and community uplift, looking to those models as somewhat parallel to a socialist system that would, at least in theory, be about responsibility for the citizens, or to the citizens. But of course, a communist might see corporate social responsibility as a way to kind of greenwash or whitewash, exploitative capitalism. So it's a very sticky and thorny subject, but it's a fascinating one because it's between the party line and the bottom line. And it would be fascinating. There's a couple people who have worked on that. Ernesto Betancourt is one in Cuba, an economist. But anyway, that's what I would say.
Okay, moving on. I think we've answered a couple of questions already here. Again, going back to my colleague Jane Rosenberg, what is the reach of the alternative internet media among Cubans on the island?
Sara, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. I mean, it is hard to know what the reach is because a lot of it still circulates offline through El Paquete, for instance. So I haven't found myself any official data. If you talk to the different editors of the independent media outlets, they know how many people access their websites and where they're connecting from. But I haven't seen a compilation, and I think it would be hard to analyze that in quantitative terms. But the feeling is that access to internet has been increasing. Connections to independent media outlets have also increased somehow, or at least that's the information I have.
Yeah, I would add two things. First, let me just correct myself. I said Ernesto Betancourt, but it's actually Rafael Betancourt, who works on corporate social responsibility in Cuba. And also the group Cuba Emprende has some interesting studies that look at that, especially during the time of COVID. A lot of the private self-employed businesses did a lot of outreach in response to COVID, and actually won some praise from the government, which was a rare thing. But in terms of this question, you can look at a couple different sources. I mean, the government reports every year in the summer updated numbers of access, and the numbers have grown from about, let's say, 5 to 10% 8 years ago, and now they report as high as 60%. But the problem of internet access, right? And you can look at that report. It's a PDF that's put out by the Office of Statistics and Information in Cuba, and the most recent one is in the high 50s, I think, of the percent. But what does it mean to have internet access? It means something vastly different in Cuba than in the U.S. Does it mean that you are on the intranet, a government kind of controlled and catered internet without access to the World Wide Web? There's even different pricing schemes. Do you have 1 hour a day on a cell phone in a public park, or do you have full internet access at home? What is the speed and quality? Which sites are blocked? Cuba continues and actually probably has increased the blockage of critical sites, both run, independent digital startups, but other sites from abroad, sites like change.org and other sites like that are periodically blocked or permanently blocked. And then finally, you have the whole phenomenon of VPNs, right? If you try to access 14 Medio from Cuba, you can't, but they have kind of like a whack-a-mole thing going on, because they have a number of different new mirror sites that have different names. Like you can actually go to a site to see 14 Medio in Cuba, but it's actually the URL is not 14 Medio. So there, I think it says Noti Cuba, like Cuba News, right? And so all the different media startups are using these kind of things. Plus, one key element to this is it's called the Trojan horse strategy. It's been studied in many countries, which is if you're independent media that gets blocked by a government, what you should do is put your content on a platform the government won't dare block, like Facebook. So Henry Constantine, who runs La Hora de Cuba in Camagüey, he has this independent news site. He was actually kicked out of journalism school a number of times in Cuba for being too critical, but he has a site that he runs, and all of their content is immediately automatically available on Facebook. So you don't have to click on their site. And the Cuban government at least hasn't yet blocked Facebook, because in order to block the content that he's putting there, they'd have to block all of Facebook, because they don't have the ability to do that. So the same is true for Twitter. The same is true for other platforms, like Medium is a good platform. And El Estornudo has used Medium as a mirror site to put up its content. So that's a strategy, and the strategies will continue as long as the censorship continues.
Okay, so we have time for one final question from Lauren Pena or Peña. She wants to know if you see the internet blackouts orchestrated by the Cuban government as a symptom of the threat that the Movimiento San Isidro and Luis Manuel Otero Alcántara and other activists such as Tania Bruguera are posing.
Sara, would you like to go first?
Yes, we know the Cuban government has been practicing with these blackouts for a while now. Are they serious about it? Are they gonna, effectively use it as a protective measure? We don't really know, but it seems to go in parallel with the the increasing protagonism of oppositional movements in the island. So let's see what happens, but it seems to go in parallel at least.
Yes, I would agree. Unequivocally, yes, that it's kind of the best of worlds and the worst of worlds, the best of times and the worst of times, in the sense that increasingly there's access to the internet, increasingly people are sounding their voices. And in part, this is thanks to the government finally listening either to their wallets or to their people, or maybe a little bit of both, because of course the government makes money every time anyone connects to the internet in Cuba, right? So that's their monopoly. But it was a Pandora's box of political headaches that they opened at the same time. And it's undeniable for me that as we've seen more people use the internet for civic, political debate and criticism, that to hold power accountable, to call power, criticize and demand response, you have the government then not just cracking down physically on those people, detaining them under house arrest without any legal justification in their homes, which has increased exponentially, really, regulating their travel within Cuba or abroad. But at the same time, you have these periodic targeted or blanket internet shutdowns that are clearly directly aimed at preventing the spread of the virus of dissent. And these leaders, Tania Bruguera, for example, Luis Manuel Otero Alcantara, are two of many people who have provoked this. I remember trying to listen to a debate like this, and I don't know right now if we have any people from Cuba, but that would be a true digital revolution if we have people watching from Cuba. So if you're in Cuba, send us a note telling you you're accessing this from Cuba. I hope that it's happening and we're creating that digital revolution. But when I tried to log on to Harvard University's talk with Tania Bruguera, 2 hours before, her phone line was cut. Who controls the phone line, right? Or her internet access was cut. ETEXA, the government, right? So yes, it's clearly a response, but the response is only provoking more resistance. And so, as Sara said, we'll have to keep watching.
So thank you, Ted and Sara. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. But before we go, let me mention that Books and Books will be hosting an in-person event, actually here in Miami, with Juan Carlos Alvarez and Wendy Guerra about the San Isidro movement, Saturday, July 24th at 8 p.m. at the Coral Gables Congregational Church. And it's a free and public event. Those of you who are here in Miami can check the website of the Books and Books bookstore. So it's been a wonderful presentation. Thank you again. Yes?
It's Carlos Manuel Alvarez.
Carlos Manuel Alvarez. Okay.
Okay.
So anyway, again, thank the audience for attending this virtual event and asking the questions. And you have that button there at the bottom of the screen. So we'll see you in our next virtual event and hopefully in person pretty soon. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jorge.
Thanks. Thanks a lot.